You gotta wonder why some homes sit abandoned for decades, especially big, huge mansions. What dark secrets have led to these places being left to rot? Gruesome crimes, disturbing hauntings, curses? Let's find out. One look at Villa de Vecchi in Italy, and it's really no surprise that it has such a dark past. I mean, it just looks like it fits the bill. Of course, being abandoned and derelict never helps matters, but still, the place looks pretty haunted. It's now become known as one of the most haunted spots in Italy, often referred to as the House of Witches. It was built in 1857 as a summer home for a man named Felix de Vecchi and his family, who suffered a lot of tragedy in the years following. Things were kind of foreboding from the start when the architect died during the construction of the building, but the real horror began in 1862. The story goes that Felix de Vecchi came home to find his wife killed and his daughter missing. The famous occultist Aleister Crowley is said to have also practiced rituals on the property. The place has been totally vacant for decades, but strange stuff still goes on, like the avalanche in 2002 that leveled everything in the area except the House of Witches, which was left completely untouched. Next on the list is the Lucy House in Uniontown, Alabama. Now, many homes in Uniontown stand totally abandoned. Environmental issues have driven a huge portion of the population out, but the Lucy House isn't just another abandoned home being overtaken by nature. No, this one is home to a very dark case. In 1994, the remains of a boy named Alan Lucy were found buried under the front porch, putting an end to a decade-old mystery. Alan Lucy lived in the home with his adoptive parents, Philip and Margaret Lucy. In May of 1985, he went missing though. A search was launched, but there were no signs of him anywhere. But then a creepy story started to spread around town. The couple's biological son, Jason, began telling classmates at school that he'd seen his father burying Alan after having killed him. Now, for some reason, his story was never taken seriously until the home had been sold and renovations were underway, and the skeletal remains of Alan Lucy were finally found. Philip Lucy was then put behind bars. The Liu family mansion, aka the Mingjiang Ghost House in Taiwan, has been abandoned for over 70 years, and it's known as one of the most haunted spots in the country. The Liu family packed up and left, and it's always been a bit of a mystery as to why. There are plenty of rumors and urban legends though, of course. One story goes that the maid was having an affair with the husband, Liu Rongyu, and when the wife found out, she made the maid's life a living hell until she couldn't handle it anymore, jumping down a well. But she wasn't gone for good. On a nightly basis, the tormented spirit of the maid would return to the home, terrorizing the family until they finally decided it was time to pack up and leave. Some say her ghost still haunts the abandoned property to this day. Another tale tells of Japanese soldiers who were holding up at the abandoned mansion during World War II. While the soldiers slept, one was keeping guard, but things turned to complete chaos when he caught a glimpse of this shadowy figure lurking around the property and opened fire. The other soldiers then woke up and in a panic started shooting too, but in the darkness and confusion they all died, having accidentally fired at each other. Next up, we have the Los Feliz house, which sat abandoned in LA's Los Feliz neighborhood for a long time. It was only just recently sold in 2020. 2475 Glendower Place is pretty infamous for a very disturbing incident on December 6th, 1959. Dr. Harold Perelson and his family lived at the home. Dr. Perelson was pretty successful, obviously. I mean, he owned a mini mansion, but at some point his mental state began to deteriorate, and the nail in the coffin was when he was screwed out of the rights to a new syringe he'd invented, having invested a ton of money in it as well. This is seemingly what threw him over the edge, and on that night in December, he snapped, killing his wife in her sleep with a hammer. Then he moved on to his eldest daughter's room. As soon as he struck her with the hammer though, she let out a scream and began pleading for her life as her father told her to lay still and keep quiet. The other siblings woke up though, all running out in the hallway to find out what was going on. Miraculously, they all managed to escape, Neighbors had heard the commotion and phoned the police, but by the time authorities arrived at the home, a copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy was left open on his nightstand, with the opening passage of the page reading, "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward path had been lost." Next on the list is Lennox Castle in Scotland, which has sat abandoned for years. It's in total disrepair and has been in especially bad shape after a fire in 2008. The place looks like your quintessential haunted castle, but double whammy, it was also a former mental hospital. It was originally built in 1841 for John Lennox Kincaid, who had ties to a notable Scottish clan. But in 1927, the land was purchased by the Glasgow Corporation, and the castle underwent a big transformation, being repurposed as a hospital for the mentally ill. Then in World War II, it was converted into a hospital for soldiers, and the mentally ill patients were transported to other buildings on the property. Life inside Lennox Castle was far from peaceful. Fights between patients were common. In one incident, a riot broke out, causing chaos and significant damage to one of the wards. Things got so out of hand that a lot of the staff, along with uninvolved patients, fled the hospital, leaving the rioters locked inside. By the 80s, the hospital had become completely outdated, and it finally closed in 2002, and it's been vacant ever since. There are tons of abandoned mansions on what is often referred to as Billionaire's Row in London, but one of them has a particularly dark history. One of these mansions, Kingsdean, was used by one of the creepiest cults in history, the Children of God, now called the Family International. If you feel like getting a good night's sleep tonight, this is a cult you're gonna probably want to avoid hearing about. The group was founded in the late 60s by dirtbag David Berg, who later became known as Moses David. The group mixed evangelical Christianity with free love ideology, regardless of age. Female members were encouraged to use intimacy in order to recruit new followers. It was highly exploitative, especially of course when it came to young people who had been born and raised within the cult. Over the years, as more survivors came forward with their stories, authorities began to investigate the COG. Leadership has changed, but the fact that this group is still around in any form is just unbelievable. The house in New Jersey where this next awful tragedy took place burnt down in the 70s, but the property is still said to have a lingering dark energy about it, and it's not hard to see why. This case is pretty grim, and the new home is pretty much identical to the old one. So in 1971, a man named John List killed his wife, his mother, and 2 offspring, all in the home. Then he left the house, went to his son's soccer game as if nothing had happened, and then killed him too once they returned home. Then he brought all the bodies into the ballroom, lined them up, cut his own face out of a family photo, and left the scene. Authorities later arrived at the home to find the bodies. All the lights were also on and the radio was blaring, tuned into a Christian radio station. John List wasn't caught until 1989. He'd fled to Denver and taken on a whole new identity. He'd even met a woman there who he'd married in 1985. The Winchester Mansion in San Jose, California is not only said to be one of the most haunted mansions in the United States, but one of the strangest. And not just one of the strangest mansions in America, but the entire world. This place is absolutely bonkers. And that's all because of Sarah Winchester, who is the wife of William Wirt Winchester of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. When Mr. Winchester died in 1881, the widowed Sarah became a little unhinged, to say the least. She began to believe that the people who'd died at the hands of her husband's Winchester rifles were now haunting her. So she started hiring workers to come in and build all these add-ons to the home, very few of which made any sense at all. The purpose? To disorient and confuse the ghosts that were apparently after her. The Winchester was always under construction. Maze-like hallways and staircases were built, leading nowhere. Doors were built for no apparent reason, and it just went on and on. The place is one big confusing nightmare, like an AI algorithm just took over with the design, not actually understanding the purpose of a home. That's a place I kind of want to check out, to be honest. Elda Castle in New York looks like a witch's house from an old fairy tale, not on the inside though. Graffiti covers the walls as the place has been abandoned for decades. There's been a rumor floating around for years that Elda Castle is cursed. The castle was the brainchild of David T. Abercrombie, the dude who helped kickstart Abercrombie and Fitch. He and his wife, Lucy Abbott Kate, were like, let's build a huge mansion. So they did, in the roaring 20s. But then, just as the paint dried and the mansion was all set, tragedy hit. First, their daughter Lucy died in an accident at her dad's factory. Then, Mr. Abercrombie himself died of rheumatic fever right there in the house. So Lucy Abbott Kate moved away with her oldest daughter. After Lucy Sr. split though, Elda fell into disrepair. Over the years, a bunch of different people have tried to fix the place up, hoping to bring it back to its former glory, but each time they've been hit with rough patches themselves. Maybe this is a place that's just better off left alone. And finally, we have the Mudhouse Mansion in Lancaster, Ohio. This is just one of the many spooky spots in the great state of Ohio. An old, creepy house with a history full of equally eerie tales and urban legends. It was originally built back in the mid-1800s, a fancy home for a rich family, but as years passed, the mansion started to fall apart. Eventually, it was abandoned and left to rot. Over time, though, people began to tell stories about the mansion. One of the creepiest stories is that the family who lived there met a tragic end inside the mansion. Some versions of the legend say they were killed by someone. Others claim they went crazy after an evil entity attached itself to the house and tormented them. There's even a tale that Bloody Mary herself was born here. In 2015, the mansion was torn down, but that hasn't stopped all the stories. Some folks say they still see ghostly figures wandering around the area where the mansion used to stand. Asylums, chemical weapons plants, a doll factory. All these buildings have two things in common. They're all abandoned, and the history behind them is dark. An abandoned hospital. Creepy. An abandoned hospital in Germany that was used in both world wars. Extra creepy. Beelitz-Heilstätten Hospital, about 30 miles outside of Berlin, is an enormous complex. It was built in 1898 by the Berlin Workers' Health Insurance Corporation. It started out housing tuberculosis patients. This was a time when tuberculosis was a real problem, a leading cause of death. So the 60-building facility was designed to give patients the best possible care with fresh air and rest. During World War I, the hospital transformed into a military hospital for the Imperial German Army, and in late 1916, a young Adolf was even treated here after he was wounded in the Battle of the Somme. You wanted abandoned buildings with evil histories? Doesn't get much more evil than that guy. The hospital was also used in World War II as a field hospital for wounded German soldiers. After the war, though, the Soviets took control of the hospital and it became a Soviet military hospital. One of the most well-known patients during the Soviet era was Erich Honecker, the last leader of East Germany. He was treated for liver cancer there in the early 90s. Now today there are parts of Beelitz-Heilstätten that are still used, mostly for neurological rehabilitation and Parkinson's research, but most of the buildings are abandoned. If you can't tell by, looking at these images, crumbling walls, peeling paint, rusted hospital equipment left behind, it's pretty nightmarish. Even if you are 100% staunchly, just do not believe in the paranormal, I'm sure you'd still get the creeps wandering around this place. Next is another abandoned hospital, this one with an even darker history though. It was an asylum. Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio, often referred to simply as the Ridges. The asylum opened in 1874, and the first patient, a young girl with epilepsy who'd been locked away by her parents because they believed she was possessed by a demon. Quite a start. Now, before it closed in 1993, it housed a variety of patients, including Civil War vets, rebellious young people, homeless people, the elderly, and even violent criminals. As the number of patients increased, so did the number of buildings. By the time it was abandoned, there were 78 buildings on the property. There are also 3 cemeteries on the grounds. The main building was supposed to house up to maybe 570 something patients, but at its peak, the asylum treated over 2,000. That is some severe overcrowding. This combined with medical staff who often lacked experience made for a pretty awful environment. Lobotomies, hydrotherapy, and electric shock therapy were common treatments, and you could land yourself here for a wide range of reasons. Menopause, menstruation issues, drinking too much, epilepsy, even asthma. You could even end up in this place for having a little too much fun with yourself in the pants area. So I would not be in this place at all. And once you're admitted, all contact with family would be cut off, which would probably be a good thing if you were in here for the latter reason. A lot of the nearly 1,700 people who died at the asylum were buried on the premises, with only a number marking their graves. But Ohio locals all know about the story of Margaret Schilling. Margaret was a patient who went missing on December 1st, 1978. 42 days later, her decomposing body was found in a rarely used area of Building 20. Her body had left a permanent stain on the concrete floor, which is still visible to this day. Yeah, that's just icky. Here's something a little different, an abandoned chemical weapons plant. Okunoshima Island off the coast of Japan has a pretty pleasant reputation these days. There are tons of rabbits that live there. So many, in fact, that the place is often referred to as Rabbit Island. But there's a darker side to this place. The island was also home to a top secret chemical weapons plant. The Japanese government chose this remote location to produce mustard gas from 1927 to 1945. Over 6,000 tons of mustard gas was manufactured on the island. The chemical weapons plant was part of a highly classified operation, and its existence was so secretive that the island was actually removed from maps. The workers at the plant were exposed to harmful chemicals, leading to severe health issues and, in some cases, death. At the end of World War II, to cover up the activities that took place, the Japanese military destroyed all records related to the chemical weapons production. Now, today, the abandoned plant is still standing, but visitors are not allowed inside because there's still a risk of contamination. In 1988, the Japanese government finally acknowledged the island's dark history and opened the Okunoshima Poison Gas Museum. St. Gerard's Hospital in Warwickshire has been abandoned since 1988. In its early days, it was used as a hospital to treat young patients, many of whom were orphans, and later on it was used to treat soldiers during World War II. So it's safe to assume this place has some lingering spirits left behind, if you believe in that sort of thing anyway. Even if you don't though, you can't deny how eerie the place looks. The place dates back to the early 20th century. It was originally built as a hospital for a boys' home. A lot of the patients coming from the home were in poor health due to their backgrounds, and there was a clear need for dedicated medical care. So the Birmingham Diocesan Rescue Society for the Protection of Homeless and Friendless Catholic Children was established, and St. Gerard's Hospital opened its doors in 1913. Imagine just being referred to as friendless, you know? You're already poor, you're already sick, and now they just assume you don't have friends? I don't know, that's kind of mean. But anyway, during World War I, it was used to care for wounded soldiers, and after the war, the hospital shifted its focus to treating tuberculosis. Do dolls creep you out? If so, then steer clear of this next spot. The exact location of the place has been kept secret in order to keep vandals away, but it's in Spain, an abandoned doll factory. The place has been left untouched since the 80s. The factory produced porcelain dolls, often using real human hair, which only adds to how unsettling the atmosphere is here. The building itself is 3 stories tall. The floor in one wing has collapsed over the years, but there isn't much graffiti or signs of exploration. Again, the exact location has been kept secret, and that just makes the place feel even more empty and eerie. When the factory closed, it seems like everyone just vanished in the middle of their workday, leaving everything behind. There are boxes of doll parts, machinery, and half-finished dolls just laying on the assembly line. Yeah, it's freaky. Next up, we have another psychiatric hospital, Hellingly Hospital in East Sussex, England. The hospital opened in 1903 and had a reputation for its harsh treatments, including electroshock therapy and, again, lobotomies. It was originally built to ease the overcrowding at the Haywards Heath Asylum, but Hellingly ended up becoming overcrowded itself. Mainly because, again, you could find yourself locked away in a mental institution for pretty much anything back in the day. One of the most notorious treatments used here was electroconvulsive therapy. This would involve sending an electric current through the brain, inducing a brief seizure. The idea was that this electrical activity could reset the brain and help cure severe mental health issues. Now, aside from how painful this would be, patients could experience some pretty severe side effects like losing their memory, or some would even just end up in catatonic states. It was abandoned in 1994, and some of the people who investigate the place today claim they've encountered ghostly apparitions. The whole place is incredibly unsettling, seeing as it's an abandoned psychiatric hospital where many patients were horribly mistreated. One of the creepiest sections, though, has to be this one, the morgue, where the metal body trays have been left behind. Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky is said to be one of the most terrifying buildings in America, and it's not hard to see why. Construction began in 1908, and it finally opened in 1910 to treat, again, tuberculosis patients. Because of how contagious it was, patients were quarantined here. The sanatorium was built as a self-sufficient community with its own zip code, post office, and farmland. Doctors and staff were also required to stay on the grounds in order to prevent the spread of the disease. Waverly Hills closed in 1961, but reopened the following year as a nursing home. This phase lasted until about 1981 when it closed again. The property then sat abandoned for about 2 decades. Today, Waverly Hills is notorious for its ghost stories. Over 6,000 people are believed to have died here, so that's not all that surprising. This place is also infamous for its body chute, a tunnel that was used to discreetly transport corpses. Apparently this is a hotspot for paranormal activity. Wonder why. Room 502 also gets a lot of activity. This room housed mentally ill tuberculosis patients, and a nurse was also said to have taken her life here. Next up, we have Letchworth Village in New York. The complex of over 130 buildings was constructed in 1911, a place to treat the mentally and physically ill. It was made to house around 2,000 patients, operating as a self-sufficient village. Patients tended farms, worked in shops, and lived in smaller, more personal dwellings, but just like with most of these places, it became overcrowded. Insufficient funding and staffing really didn't help either, so the intentions were good, but it didn't stay that way. Patients were often forgotten in this isolated community, and Letchworth also became known for using patients in clinical trials, especially when it came to the experimental polio vaccine in the 50s. The institution finally closed in 1996 after decades of reports of mistreatment and neglect. There's a small cemetery on the grounds with about 900 shallow graves, most who died very young, and because so many of the patients had no contact with their families, there aren't any names on their headstones, just numbers. Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Spring City, Pennsylvania was built in 1908, originally named the Eastern Estate Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. The institution soon became overcrowded, and for decades there was tons of controversy surrounding the place. Patients lived in harsh living conditions, forced labor was also a thing. A lot of the bad press started coming to light in the 60s and early 70s. The awful conditions were exposed in a series of investigative reports and lawsuits. The reports detailed the overcrowding, the unsanitary living conditions, and the neglect and mistreatment of the patients by the staff. In 1977, a lawsuit ruled that the conditions at Pennhurst violated patients' constitutional rights, but the place wouldn't close down until 1987. Riverview Hospital in Vancouver, Canada. The hospital opened in 1913 as the Easondale Hospital for the Insane. It was later renamed Riverview Hospital and became one of the largest mental health institutions in British Columbia. It had been built to help alleviate the overcrowding at other mental health facilities in the province. The facility included big gardens, greenhouses, and farms where patients could also work. Surprise, surprise, but overcrowding became a problem here too. The hospital's population peaked in the 50s with over 4,500 patients. Treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock therapy, and lobotomies were also used. Things started to shift in the 60s and 70s though, with a focus on more community-based care. A lot of the patients were released into the community, but many of them didn't have good support systems in place and ended up living on the street. The hospital officially closed in 2012, and some of the buildings are still in use. Most of them have been left to decay though. These asylums have sat abandoned for decades, their legacies of horrible mistreatment trapped within their walls.
These are the stories of some of the most notorious abandoned mental asylums in the world. In 1925, the Forest Haven Asylum opened its doors in Laurel, Maryland. The campus was 250 acres and it boasted 30 buildings. Patients, then referred to as inmates, were taught job skills in a communal environment that empowered them emotionally and mentally and boosted their physical health as well. The institution was revolutionary, until it wasn't. You know how the story goes. Funding gets cut, staff gets cut, or replaced with unqualified personnel, conditions worsen, and the entire facility begins to fall into a dangerous state of disrepair. What's worse is that as things got worse, many members of staff began taking their frustrations out on their patients, either ignoring them completely, leaving them to die of their various ailments, causing them physical harm, including scalding them with hot water, or even violating them sexually. Eventually, bodies began to pile up on the grounds, some of which had been subjected to medical experiments prior to their deaths. The bodies were buried in a field in shallow, unmarked graves with a single headstone to represent the lot.
Severals Hospital in Essex, England finally closed its doors in 1997, and it's sat abandoned ever since. Its history is just as dark as the now empty corridors. It opened in 1913 to treat patients with mental illness, which back then included a pretty broad gamut of people. Too broad. People were housed here for all sorts of irrational reasons. Even women who'd been victims of SA could be sent here, or women who had given birth to illegitimate offspring. For some reason, it was just decided that they needed to be separated from society, and it was often their own families who would commit them. On top of all the ill practices, which I'll get to in a moment, this place was also bombed in World War II. 38 patients in the hospital's West Wing were killed in 1942 when the Germans dropped 3 bombs on the grounds. Many of the patients were buried nearby. In the 50s, new quote-unquote treatments started being implemented, like frontal lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy. It was completely inhumane, especially, again, when you consider how many patients were here for reasons we'd think are just unimaginable today.
In 1911, the small village of Thiels, New York, located about 40 miles north of Manhattan, was chosen as the grounds of Letchworth Village Asylum, an experimental asylum that had plans of dedicating the entire village to the mentally ill. 2,000 patients, 2,000 acres, and over 130 buildings. The goal was to create a place where patients could live freely and experience a full life. Unfortunately, the institution became vastly overcrowded almost immediately, which led to a shortage in funds, which in turn led to a shortage in staff, which culminated in the gross mistreatment of the patients who had come or been sent to the asylum in hopes of a better life. In the mid-1900s, unbeknownst to the patients, the facility began using them as guinea pigs to test the new polio vaccine, which is likely why the asylum was allowed to exist for so long despite the treacherous conditions and the routine mistreatment of the patients. In 1996, the facility shut its doors after a series of successful human rights campaigns outlawed the unethical practices as well as the abysmal living conditions of the asylum. When all was said and done, more than 900 shallow graves, most of them small in size, if you know what I mean, were found hidden in a forest next to the asylum.
North Wales Hospital was the first mental hospital in the country, completing its construction in 1848. It only closed down in 1995. That is a lot of history. It had first been built to house just 200 patients, but by 1899, there were as many as 1,500. The intention behind the hospital was admirable. They didn't want it to be like the workhouses of the time, which were basically just dumping grounds where people who'd been cast out or forgotten by society would do hard labor. Instead, they wanted it to be a place of restorative treatment. Unfortunately, though, like with so many of these places, it ended up degrading into the exact type of system it had originally set out to replace. Patients' well-being was mostly set aside, and many of the tasks at the facility were carried out by them. They'd basically become custodians of the hospital.
In 1888, Volterra Psychiatric Hospital was founded in Volterra, Italy, as an asylum for the mentally ill. The plan was to create a completely functioning and closed society for those suffering from ailments of the mind. The society would have its own shops, agricultural companies, its own judicial system, and even its own currency. That was the plan, at least. In 1902 and the years that followed, many new patients arrived at the facility, and many new buildings were erected to accommodate them. By the 1950s and 60s, the asylum had become one of the largest in Italy, but there was something sinister going on behind the scenes. At the first sign of depression, schizophrenia, or even an unwillingness to conform to societal norms, patients were treated with isolation, electroshock therapy, insulin-induced comas, pills, and literal poison. Furthermore, nurses and doctors were not required to communicate a patient's treatment plan to their family members. The institution closed its doors in 1978 after Italy mandated the regulation of compulsory medical treatments, but prior to the closure, one patient left a very prominent mark on the outer walls of the Volterra Psychiatric Hospital. Hundreds of carvings etched into the stone exterior of the buildings. A long story told by one man, Nanetti, who was a prisoner at the asylum for many years before eventually being moved to a regulated hospital and finally being laid to rest in 1994.
Building 25, the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center, has sat abandoned for decades. It's one of the grimiest places I've ever seen on one of these lists, gotta say. The Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, New York, is actually still in operation today, aside from Building 25, which closed in the early 70s. And it looks like it closed in the early 70s. As you probably know, New York in the 70s was basically a gang-infested war zone, and the bad stuff even extended to this hospital. The place saw 22 violent crimes, 130 burglaries, 52 fires, a riot, multiple reports of SA, and all of this happened within the span of about 20 months. I'm guessing a lot of the action happened in Building 25, which is why it was sealed off. It was never sold either. It's just been sitting there collecting pigeon crap, literally. Apparently, there's a lot of it. One spot has a mountain of it several feet high.
In 1878, the Danvers State Lunatic Asylum opened its doors atop a hill in Danvers, Massachusetts. Originally made to be a self-sustaining establishment with several treatment amenities on site designed to fully cure patients of their ailments, the facility was equipped to house 450 patients, but soon it was home to more than 2,000 individuals suffering from various mental disorders. Patients would often be seen walking around the facility naked and covered in filth, and soon the treatment methods became more and more barbaric and invasive. Electroshock therapy and poorly performed lobotomies became the norm. Patients who underwent these treatments often died, or just ended up worse off than they were when they entered the asylum. And when these practices failed, patients were restrained and forced to live out the rest of their days roaming the dilapidated halls of the asylum in straitjackets. In 1939 alone, 278 patients died as a result of prefrontal lobotomies. The facility began shutting down in 1985, but it didn't fully close until 1992. When all was said and done, the Danvers State Lunatic Asylum was essentially just a place where the mentally ill went to be tormented and to die.
Rolling Hills Asylum opened in 1826 as a working farm for the poor, but soon a whole swath of different people would be housed here, including widows, orphans, and the mentally ill. Around 1,700 deaths were reported here, but many more were never even documented. The building has become rather infamous for its hauntings. The scariest spirit is said to be that of Emmy, a cruel nurse who is said to have worked in the infirmary wing. Patients and even other staff were terrified of her. She seemed to take this sick pleasure in tormenting patients and was even rumored to practice black magic.
In 1888, the Fernald State Asylum in Waltham, Massachusetts opened its doors. It didn't take long before it earned itself the reputation of being one of the most despicable facilities of its kind, likely due to the fact that the hospital, if you can even call it that, was known largely for its fondness of illegal radiation testing. While the hospital was originally designed to house the mentally ill, the third superintendent, Walter E. Fernland, eventually decided to admit patients who were either poor or simply unwanted in society because he believed in selective breeding and didn't want those kinds of people to participate in growing the population in any way, shape, or form. The asylum became overcrowded and living conditions began taking a downward spiral. And then the 1940s rolled around, which is when researchers from Harvard and MIT, funded by the Quaker Oats Company, began exposing patients to small doses of radiation to test their absorption of the toxic energy. Eventually, the radioactive chemicals were injected into patients under false pretenses. More than 295 patients died during their time in the asylum. In the 1970s, a lawsuit forced the facility to cease their illegal testing, rectify the conditions of the hospital, and bring the facility up to a humane standard. And in 1989, MIT and Quaker Oats settled in a a class action lawsuit regarding the radiation tests. But believe it or not, the facility didn't officially shut down until early 2014, at which time the few patients left under the hospital's care were relocated to other facilities in the state.
The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, possibly the most infamous abandoned mental asylum in the world. It was founded in 1863. By 1938, it was way over capacity, housing 6 times more patients than it was originally built for. Patients didn't even have their own rooms. They were packed together, sometimes 6 patients to a single bed. It was chaotic and unsanitary with no heating, although you probably wouldn't need heating being in a bed with 6 other people. That is horrific. The place got so out of control that patients would often just roam the halls totally unsupervised, and not only were patients being neglected, but the building itself was falling apart. One of the most nightmarish parts of the facility, though, was the experimental lobotomy lab run by a man named Walter Freeman. He was a one-man lobotomy factory. He performed thousands of lobotomies using his so-called ice pick method, which was really just a quick and easy but brutal way of performing a lobotomy. They were done without anesthesia and often outside of an operating room. He'd found a way for psychiatrists to perform the lobotomy anytime and anywhere. What an achievement to be remembered for. Reports of the mistreatment and neglect started surfacing around 1949, but the asylum only closed its doors in 1994.
Buildings covered in lush green overgrowth and buried in the sand, entire cities plucked straight from Europe and dropped in the middle of nowhere, a seriously spooky island that is completely off limits, and an abandoned basement filled with exotic fish. Let's talk about some of the craziest places that look like they belong in another dimension. The beautiful Villa dei Mulini, or Valley of the Mills as it's called in English, was once a profitable milling town in Italy back in the early 1900s, named after the flour mills that used to operate in the area. The now abandoned town is located not far from the Amalfi Coast in Positano in Italy, and I must say, it's absolutely stunning. Along with flour mills, the Valley of the Mills boasted a swan mill and a handful of other factories, but in the early 1940s, nearby pasta mills took over flour production, and the city became largely uninhabited. From there, nature took its course, branching out and covering many of the man-made surfaces in the area. Today, Valley dei Mulini sits completely abandoned, but that might not be the case for long. In 2019, the Italian government signed off on reconstructing the town, which would require removing the greenery from abandoned buildings, reinforcing and refurbishing said buildings, and building new ones. The World of Wildlife Fund was not happy with this decision and actually filed a lawsuit against the restoration company, stating that the environmental impact of the project greatly threatens wildlife in the area and highly increases the risk of landslides. As of right now, it's unclear if the restoration project will continue, but personally, I hope not, because I think this place is absolutely breathtaking just the way it is. As a general rule of thumb, when you want to visit Paris, you go to France. Unless, of course, you were hoping to see a completely abandoned and eerily creepy version of the City of Light, in which case you would head over to Tainduchang in China, aka China's very own Paris. The town was built in 2007, just a few hours away from Shanghai, and it boasts its very own Eiffel Tower, which stands 300 feet tall, just over 1/3 of the height of the original. The town was originally built to be home to 10,000 people, but due to its remote location, only a fraction of that number are currently living there, and it's essentially a ghost town. The majority of traffic through the town comes from newlyweds looking for a place to take wedding photos and tourists eager to get a peek at what could possibly be one of the strangest replica towns to date. Hashima Island, also known as Battleship Island in Japan, is truly fascinating. Partly because it looks like a glitch in the Matrix dropped it here from another dimension, partly because of its history, and partly because it's believed to be extremely haunted. Hashima Island was discovered in the 1800s about 9 miles off the coast of Nagasaki, and in 1887 it was converted by the Japanese government into a coal mining facility. Soon the small island became home to more than 5,000 individuals. As you can imagine, it was extremely overcrowded. For a while, business was booming, but then the demand for coal significantly decreased as the popularity of petroleum grew. The mine was shut down in 1974, which is also when the inhabitants of Hashima decided to either either move back to Nagasaki or settle down somewhere new. After that, the island was declared a ghost town, a fitting distinction seeing as many people believe that Japanese prisoners had been forced to work and die on the island after World War II. Not only that, but it's believed that the prisoners haunt the island to this day. While this next one is not an entire island, or even a city for that matter, the New World Shopping Mall located in Bangkok, Thailand is definitely worth mentioning because it truly is one of the most fascinating abandoned buildings in the whole entire world. The mall was developed in the early 80s, but lasted for only 50 years before shutting down completely for a variety of foreseen and unforeseen reasons. You see, when the mall was being built, developers failed to acquire permits, or pay attention to building code for that matter. And so the mall was actually built 7 stories higher than was permitted. Because of this, floors 5 to 11 were dismantled and the mall was left roofless. This led to heavy rains completely flooding the bottom floor, which in turn led to the mall becoming overrun by mosquitoes and gnats. The solution: to turn that bottom floor into a pond for exotic fish who would help with pest control. The plan worked, but perhaps a bit too well, as fish bred at such a rapid rate that soon the accidental man-made pond was completely overrun. The mall shut down in 1994 after a fire broke out in the building and debris from the roof killed one of the mall's patrons. Today, the building sits in a completely dilapidated state, off limits to the general public. For a while, the pond remained until 2015, when it was completely empty due to safety concerns. However, some pockets of water and even some fish remain there to this day. I have to say, I'm a sucker for a town turned green, so of course I had to mention Taiwan, China, a once thriving fishing village now completely cloaked in clinging ivy. Located just 100 kilometers, 62 miles from the bustling streets of Shanghai, Taiwan was once home to 3,000 people, mainly fishermen and their families. Prior to the 1990s, it was a bountiful town, but as the turn of the century came near, the seafood supply became insufficient and the town's residents moved back to the mainland. In just 10 years, Taiwan was completely covered in a thick layer of lush vegetation that continues to consume the man-made structures in the area to this day. The island is open to tourists though. In fact, many of the island's former residents now make a living off showing tourists around the island, but many areas are off limits due to their dilapidated and unstable states. But as long as you stay on the path and listen to your guide, I'm sure you'll be just fine. Next up, we have Centralia, Pennsylvania, because what's more other dimensionally than a town that is perpetually on fire, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Centralia was once a small, peaceful town home to about 2,800 residents, but everything changed in the 1960s when combustion in an underground coal mine caused a fire to break out and spread through the town's underground cave systems. While this might sound like a great reason to immediately pack your bags and head out, I mean, the town was quite literally burning from the inside out, the residents of Centralia were, for the most part, unfazed. It wasn't until 1979 when a local gas station owner noticed that his underground gas tanks had begun to reach alarmingly high temperatures that the townspeople even began to consider abandoning the town. And it still wasn't until 1982 that they actually started to leave after a sinkhole opened up and began spitting out lethal amounts of carbon monoxide gas. Still, believe it or not, 5 residents remain living in Centralia, the town of toxic gas and fire, to this very day. Couldn't be me. While I am well aware that I did imply that it doesn't get more other dimensionally than a town on literal fire, I believe I was wrong, because I think an island where the soil is made up of 50% of human ash is just a little bit more out of this world than an everlasting coal mine fire. Or maybe not, but we're gonna include Poveglia Island anyways, because in my opinion, it is truly something else. The island of Poveglia, located between Venice and Lido in Italy, is not only abandoned but strictly off limits by order of the Italian government. Why? Well, honest to God, because it's believed to be extremely haunted. That's the actual reason. You see, back in 1776, the island was used as a quarantine station for those suffering from the plague. More than 160,000 infected individuals lived and died on Poveglia, many of which were cremated after death, which is what contributed to the high percentage of human remains in the soil. But it doesn't end there, because in the late 1800s, the island was used as a mental hospital where it is believed that the head doctor routinely tormented his patients. When the hospital eventually shut down, reports of ghost sightings and hearing screams became so frequent that in 1968 the Italian government decided to make the entire island completely off limits. Today, the island, as beautiful and as haunted as ever, sits completely abandoned, home to nothing more than wildlife, lush greenery, dilapidated buildings, and apparently a whole bunch of ghosts. Okay, while this next one isn't actually abandoned anymore, it was for a good almost 2,000 years, and it still does kind of feel like stepping into an entirely different dimension, not to mention the history is incredibly fascinating. So let's talk about Pompeii, how it came to be abandoned, and what life looks like in the city today. Pompeii, located in southern Italy's Campania region, was once home to between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants who enjoyed eating, drinking, fighting, hunting, and ritual practices. But all that changed when in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius, a massive volcano considered active to this day, erupted and wiped out the entire city of Pompeii in the span of just 2 days. More than 2,000 casualties occurred as a result, with many bodies becoming frozen in time as the lava encased and then solidified around them. After the tragic event, Pompeii was abandoned, likely out of fear and devastation, for more than 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 16th century, when the city was rediscovered by Domenico Fontana, that reconstruction of the area began. Today, the city of Pompeii is home to approximately 25,000 individuals, and for the most part, the economy is supported by tourists eager to gaze upon the faces of these stone figures and learn more about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of the city. In the early 20th century, 12% of the world's diamonds were being produced by the small town of Kolmanskop in Namibia. In 1912, Germany took over Namibia and filled the town with impressive European agriculture, including a state-of-the-art music hall and an incredibly classy pub. Relatively speaking, of course, as the words classy and pub are somewhat juxtaposed. Anyways, for a while production was solid and business was booming, but eventually the town was abandoned for bigger and better things. You see, sometime around the 1950s, richer diamond sources were found further south, and so many of the miners working in Kolmanskop moved on to bigger, better, and shinier things. By the 1960s, the town was completely abandoned. Without anyone to maintain the area, sandstorms quickly took over, and soon the entire city became one with the dunes. Ross Island in India looks like it comes from a dimension where trees grow into the shape of shelters, and there is no need for mortar or brick. Of course, that is not the case, because Ross Island exists in our dimension where trees don't form houses, but apparently they do engulf them in a way that is beautiful, eerie, and incredibly fascinating. Ross Island is one of over 500 small islands that make up the Nicobar and Andaman Islands. In the 1850s, it was used as a convict settlement by British authorities to house a significant number of captured members of the Indian Rebellion. In 1941, an earthquake devastated the island, and Japan swooped in and took it over, using Ross Island as a safe haven during the Second World War. When the war ended, ownership of the island was returned to India. Today, it sits mostly abandoned. However, tourists are welcome to the island, which is just a quick boat ride away from the mainland, and the beaches are stunning, so if you're in the area, I'd highly recommend you checking it out.
Today, we step into the world of science, creepy science.
Ooh.
We're talking about some of the creepiest experiments, from history, and some of the creepiest abandoned labs.
Yeah, abandoned for good reason.
Yes, a lot of them.
Thank God that they're no longer operative today. James, take it away.
I will. And we're starting off with an abandoned biology lab. TikToker Brian Sansevero posts videos exploring abandoned places or just making memes about them. But his abandoned biology lab has to be one of the creepiest on his channel. This lab in New Hampshire is full of equipment and specimens that had been left behind. I mean, you have the typical stuff you'd find in old abandoned labs, Elminer flasks and other tools and stuff, but there was also a wide variety of animals in jars. Frogs, snakes, turtles, pigs. The creepiest had to be the human brain though, which Brian didn't show on video but listed as something he saw while filming in the video description. Definitely some spooky stuff. Who here would be taking some of that stuff home with you though? Gotta say, I'd be tempted. I'd take a human brain with me, just leave it right on the coffee table. It's a conversation starter.
Next up on our list today, we have the abandoned Anderlecht Veterinary Labs located in Anderlecht, Brussels. The laboratory was constructed in the early 20th century, and it was one of 19 buildings located on the grounds of the veterinary school. In 1991, the building was abandoned when the school relocated to another district. What was left behind was gross and unethical and gross. It appears that what had been going on behind the closed doors of the Institute was much more so macabre experimentation than classical scientific exploration. How, you might ask, did myself and historians come to that conclusion? Well, you see, after the building was abandoned, it was, as many abandoned places are, explored, and those who entered the laboratory were met with dilapidated hallways, beakers, bottles, and needles filled with questionable fluids, rusty old medical equipment, and animal heads and brains jammed into jars with formaldehyde, as well as new, never-before-seen animals created by sewing together the various parts of cats, dogs, rats, birds, and pigs to create something that spits in the face of natural order. Would I recommend going here? No. Do I assume that at least a handful of you have gone or will go anyways? Yeah, I do.
Next up, we have the Jupiter factory, sitting on the outskirts of Pripyat. It was abandoned in 2002, but before the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, there was allegedly some fishy stuff going on in this place. Officially, the factory was used to produce radio and audio equipment, but supposedly this was just a facade. The factory was apparently a secret military research and production facility involved in nuclear weapons. It opened in 1980 and employed about 3,500 people. On top of the secret military tests and equipment being produced here, there was also said to have been a robotics department. As for what these robotics were, who knows? After the Chernobyl disaster, the facility became a radiological lab used for testing decontamination techniques. So whatever top secret stuff was used there is gone now. There's not a whole lot left in the place. Most of it has been gutted. There are, some old posters on the walls and some equipment scattered about, but it's mostly just a rusty old building with moss covering the floor.
Okay, next up, Vozrozhdeniya Island's labs, because I love torturing myself with things I can't pronounce. Grammar police, drop me the phonetics in the comments. I know you were gonna do it anyways. Back to the important stuff. During the 1920s, the Soviet Union officials were looking for a place, isolated and surrounded by desert, where they could perform some pretty dangerous biological weapons tests. They genetically modified the plague, anthrax, smallpox, brucellosis, tularemia, botulinum, and Venezuela equine encephalitis. Again, correct me in the comments. Anyways, they modified these pathogens so that they would all be resistant to medical treatment. This practice, of course, completely violated the 1972 treaty between Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, which strictly banned the use of biological weapons in any capacity. But it gets worse, because not only did they create these weapons, they tested them too, on as many as 300 monkeys who during the 18 years of the lab's operation were exposed to the viruses, killed within weeks by the viruses, and then autopsied so that Russian scientists could see the extent of the virus's damage on their bodies. Eventually, the waters surrounding the island dried up, and it became part of the surrounding desert. While the majority of pathogens would have been destroyed by now due to high temperatures, time, and harsh conditions, it is highly likely that the medical treatment-resisted anthrax has survived to this day, because that's just what it does, and it's likely buried beneath the sands surrounding the abandoned laboratory. Don't go there, please.
A TikToker named Richard Exploratory filmed this abandoned animal testing facility in Minnesota. The place looks like a complete horror show. Not only does it have the unsettling atmosphere of a rundown old abandoned place, but the fact that it was an animal testing facility just makes it extra icky. And the place was huge, 10 floors with different testing facilities on each. Some of the creepiest things they came across were the cages where they kept the animals, still mostly intact. Of course, they found the morgue with the autopsy exam tables still sitting there. There were also tons of research and test samples left behind, including a test sample with a label reading radioactive on it. Probably something that should have been disposed of properly rather than being left behind in a place where people are capable of sneaking into.
Next up, we've got Unit 731, a laboratory located in a Japanese-occupied bunker built in China in 1941. A laboratory where up to 12,000 men, women, and young people were killed in some of the most barbaric ways you can think of. You see, autopsies were common practice in Unit 713, but the thing is, things were done a bit differently by the Japanese surgeons performing them at the time. For starters, the patients which the autopsies were being performed on were alive. And they weren't given anesthesia either, and they were exposed to deadly biological and chemical weapons during the process as well. It was really messed up. But wait, there's more. The lab bred plague-infected fleas and then airdropped them on various cities throughout China. While the bunker was originally thought to be lost, recently archaeologists discovered an underground structure near the Chinese city of Anda that they believe to be the infamous Unit 731. The structure is a complex maze of tunnels and rooms, with some rooms showing evidence of having once been laboratories, holding cells, dissection rooms, and viewing rooms. Not a great look.
The next place was about as despicable as it gets. Fernald State School in Massachusetts, which has sat abandoned since 2014. This place was built in 1848 as a mental institution, but it's gone down in history as one of the worst facilities of its kind because of the illegal radiation testing. Yeah, that'll do it. So this testing was done, of course, on patients, many of whom were underage, and these unethical experiments in radiation were sponsored by institutions like MIT and the Quaker Oats Company. It involved feeding the young patients radioactive materials in their breakfast cereals to study the effects the radiation would have on the human body. They were told they were a part of a science club and promised extra treats and outings in order to bribe them to participate. And was there consent from the parents? Well, apparently some of them did consent, which I find more disturbing than if it all been done in secret. What the hell kind of parent would consent to experiments like this? Incredibly sad and disturbing.
Next up, we have an abandoned lab discovered in China by a Chinese civilian. The discovery was made on February 22nd of 2020, and well, it's pretty disturbing. While exploring abandoned buildings in China, a man came across what he thought was just another fun place for urban exploration. But he was wrong, because the videos he shared online do not look fun at all. He is seen entering the building to discover that it is in fact an abandoned laboratory. The whole thing is in complete disrepair, and according to him, it smells overwhelmingly of death. The explorer decides to follow the smell down into a basement, where he discovers a concrete pool filled with dark water and a pile of human remains in various states of decomposition. Reasonably so, he runs out of and far away from the building. But 10 months later, for some reason, he returns. The bodies are still there and appear to have gone into further states of decomposition. Not only that, but there are even more bodies in the pool now, and a small bag of bones is found inside of the basement as well. Because of all of this, people online began speculating that the abandoned building was linked to the Chinese organ black market, and that the government must be in some way involved with the scandal. After that, the man's channel was removed from the Chinese versions of YouTube and TikTok, only to come back 3 days later with all of the videos of the discovery having been wiped completely from the site, and he never brought it up again. Didn't even mention it, and he was pretty creeped out, so it seems like a cover-up to me. What do you think? Let me know.
Letchworth Village was an institution in New York for people with developmental disabilities. It was basically a small village, originally being built with the intent for patients to lead independent lives. But the utopian idea of the place didn't really pan out. Letchworth Village has a dark past, a lot of it to do with the unethical clinical trials and experiments that would go on in the lab. In the 50s, the facility was used for testing an early version of the polio vaccine, but it was tested on mental patients without their consent. They weren't able to understand or agree to the experiments, and reports from the time described poorly maintained conditions. And as the years passed, the mistreatment and neglect at Letchworth Village became more well known, and the institution became a symbol of the horrors of outdated mental health care practices. By the time it closed in 1996, many of the buildings had fallen into ruin.
And finally, we have an abandoned laboratory located in Midland, Michigan, that most certainly did not meet the standards of any kind of public health and safety act out there. Why? Well, because it was unlicensed, unregulated, and it was being run out of an apartment complex that housed multiple other tenants who were completely unaware of what had been happening either just below, just above, or just beside them. On November 19th of 2015, it was discovered during a routine fire inspection that a previous resident of the complex had been using one of the now abandoned units as a lab, and he had stocked that lab with various hazardous chemicals, some of which were either explosive or toxic. Officials also found organic compounds in the unit, but did not specify which. Luckily, the presence of the makeshift laboratory was discovered before anyone got hurt. Tenants were evacuated as all potential hazards were removed from the unit, which hopefully now sits empty and has not since been rented out to a nice local family. Just saying. I know that the economy has gone to crap recently, but I don't know, maybe you'll get a discount on one of these places because they're pure evil.
Yeah. You said it. Let's dive right in.
Let's get into it.
Hamilton Palace has stood abandoned for over 2 decades and was never finished. It's also bigger than Buckingham Palace. Hamilton Palace has quite the story behind it. It's a massive mansion that was designed for a guy named Nicholas Van Hoogstraten. He's a big-time businessman and convicted criminal. Back in 2000, things hit a bit of a snag in the project. Van Hoogstraten had a falling out with his architect, and the mansion project was derailed. And since then, it's just been sitting there unfinished. People even started calling it the Ghost House of Sussex, because apparently it was a little haunted. But if you're curious about what's inside, good luck getting close. The place is surrounded by thick trees and there are signs warning you to stay away. The place is apparently also surrounded by cameras and rabid dogs, so not exactly welcoming. Some locals thought the mansion could be used to help the homeless, but Van Hoogstraten, who was first jailed in 1968 for enlisting a couple of his underlings to hurl a grenade at the home of a former business associate, well, he just shot that idea down. He does not think much of homeless folks, apparently, saying that they're just lazy and a drain on society. He also insisted that the project has not been abandoned and will eventually be completed. As of now, though, Hamilton Palace remains totally empty.
Next up, we've got Lennox Castle, built in Scotland in 1812 for John Lennox, who belonged to a prominent Scottish family. Fast forward to the 1930s, and the castle has been converted into an asylum for the mentally ill, where patients were often brutalized by hospital staff. Beatings, starvings, and restraints were common practice, which kind of makes sense when you take into consideration the fact that fewer than half of the members of staff were actually trained nurses. It was also incredibly overcrowded and filthy. During World War II, the castle was also used as a hospital, and so patients suffering from mental illnesses were forcibly removed from the main building and crammed into other overcrowded buildings on the property. Patients became agitated and fights began to break out on a regular basis. And then one day a riot happened, during which many patients and many members of staff fled the grounds. The rioters, however, were locked inside of the castle, where they caused significant damage to the interior, themselves, and their fellow imprisoned patients. Countless people died on the property, likely due to fights, violent acts, and various illnesses, and they were all buried in unmarked graves on the grounds. The asylum/hospital finally closed its doors in 2002 and has sat abandoned ever since, although there have been talks about having it converted into a condo building. So James, if you're on the market, I've got just the place for you.
Hacienda Napolis now operates as a jungle-themed amusement park, but the property used to belong to a small-time criminal who I'm sure none of you have heard of before, Pablo Escobar. Yeah, nuts. Imagine enjoying a fun afternoon in the sun with your family on property where one of the most notorious cartel leaders in history once lived. Hacienda Napolis in Colombia has a wild history. Back in the day, it belonged to the big boss of the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar. He put it together in the 70s, and it was really something else. Remember the push it to the limit montage in Scarface, where Tony Montana starts making it rich? He's buying all this wild stuff for his mansion. Well, this place makes Scarface's mansion look like a basement apartment. The place was huge, a massive estate with a mansion, a zoo. Yes, a full zoo, a bull ring, a soccer field, and even a private airstrip. Tony Montana just had a tiger. The zoo on Escobar's property was packed with exotic animals, elephants, giraffes, hippos, and lions. But when he met his end in 1993, the government swooped in and took over the estate, and it fell into disrepair real quick. The animals either got moved, killed, or they ran off into the wild. The mansion got looted and trashed, and the airstrip was demolished. Most of the buildings got torn down over time as well, but a few are still standing.
Next on our list today we have Elda Castle, built in Ossington, New York in the 1920s by David T. Abercrombie. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because David Abercrombie was the co-founder of Abercrombie & Fitch, a clothing company started in 1892. David moved into the mansion while it was still under construction with his wife Lucy Kate and their 4 children Elizabeth, Lucy Jr., David Jr., and Abbott. Life was good until the construction of the mansion was completed in 1928 and misfortune befell the family. Lucy Jr. died in an accident at her father's factory, and then David Sr., the Abercrombie founder, died in his home of an intense fever. After that, the house was abandoned by the family. Since then, several different owners have attempted to fix up the abandoned and decaying mansion, but have abandoned the project, I'm saying abandoned a lot, completely after encountering extremely bad luck, many of them having attributed to the home itself, which I'm now thinking is probably definitely cursed.
Chateau Miranda has now been demolished, but it stood abandoned for decades, and it was rumored to be haunted. It was built back in 1866 in Belgium. The family needed a safe spot during the French Revolution, so they set up this massive castle. The place was kinda like the castle from Beauty and the Beast. It had 500 rooms, 500, plus a tall tower, a chapel, a library, and a ballroom. Later on, during World War II, it became an orphanage and a hospital, and that's where the darkness comes in, because were orphanages back in the day ever good places? And obviously hospitals, people die all the time. After the war though, the family left it behind, and with nobody taking care of it, the castle started falling apart. People even said it was haunted by ghosts of the orphans and soldiers who had been housed there. By 2017, it was in such bad shape that the owners decided to tear it down.
Next on our list today we have Villa de Vici. You should probably be able to guess where it's located based off the name alone, but if you can't, no worries, because I will tell you now. Villa de Vici is a beautiful, creepy, abandoned mansion located near Lake Como in Italy, which is stunning, by the way. Construction of the house, now nicknamed the House of Witches, started in 1854 and lasted until 1875, when the house was finally complete. It was built as a summer home, as most houses in Lake Como are, for Count Felix de Vici, but of course when they moved in, their good luck moved out, and so did the luck of the contractor apparently, who died just a year after the house was built. Now back to the Count. In 1862, after a day out on the lake, Count de Vici returned home to his summer mansion to find his wife dead and his daughter missing. He searched for a year, but eventually gave up trying and took his own life inside of the mansion. After the Count's death, his brother moved into the mansion, but abandoned it in the 1960s, and in 2002, an avalanche came that wiped out all of the houses in the area. Except, you guessed it, Villa de Vici, which stands tall to this day, super creepy, and probably cursed.
There is a cottage in the village of St. Osyth, which is said to be one of the most haunted homes in England. It's referred to as the Cage, because it used to be a small jail up until 1908. But there's an even darker history to the building. All the way back in 1582, 13 witches were held there while awaiting trial, one of which was Ursula Kemp, who is a pretty infamous supposed witch. She actually admitted to intentionally causing harm to some of her neighbors. She was a folk healer who locals would often come to for help with various ailments. So apparently this place is almost unlivable because of all the paranormal activity. One owner, who moved out of the place in 2004, claimed she'd experienced violent activity, objects being thrown at her, doors slamming. She would see this shadowy demonic figure resembling a goat that would growl. Apparently one time it even spanked her. She even said she was pushed by some unseen force while pregnant. So yeah, it was time to move.
Next up, we have the Los Feliz Killing House, located in Los Feliz, Los Angeles. The mansion is the former home of Dr. Harold Perelson, his wife, their son Joel, and their 2 daughters, Judy and Debbie. Life was good for the Perelsons until it wasn't. And it really wasn't on December 6th of 1959, when Dr. Harold decided to take the lives of all 4 members of his family. In the middle of the night, the doctor took a ball peen mean hammer to his wife's head and killed her in her sleep, before moving on to Joel, Judy, and Debbie, who were luckily able to escape before meeting the same fate as their mother. After the ordeal, Dr. Harold killed himself by drinking a bottle of acid. Police believe that the doctor had snapped after being screwed out of the rights of his invention of a new kind of syringe, which is really no excuse, but it's what they believe happened. After the incident, the house went on the market and it was purchased by the Enriquez family, who used it as a storage unit up until 2016, when they sold it to a young couple who apparently couldn't stomach the vibe of the place, because just a short while after they purchased the home, it went back on the market, where it remains, sitting empty, creepy, to this day.
If you're from the US or Canada, you don't really need to travel all the way to Europe to see a castle. Right in upstate New York is an abandoned Gothic-style castle that was built by a man named Ralph Wards Dundas. Construction started in 1915, but Dundas died in 1921 before the castle had been completed, and more tragedy followed. Dundas had been building the castle for his family, but his wife had been mentally unwell for some time, and with the death of her husband, her mental state just continued to deteriorate. She only lived in the massive home with her daughter for a short time before being taken to an asylum. The daughter was now incredibly wealthy though, but not for long. The caretakers of the castle, who were meant to be looking after her, ended up robbing her blind. She ended up moving to England, but just like her mother, her mental state began to decline and she was whisked away to an asylum as well.
And finally, we have the John List House, built in 1893 in New Jersey. Now, fast forward to November of 1971, John List, a former military man, is living in the mansion with his mother, his wife Helen, who had been suffering from syphilis at the time, their daughter Patricia, and their sons Frederick and John Jr. And one day, he just snaps. While Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. were out of the house, John Sr. grabbed a semi-automatic handheld weapon and fired a projectile into the back of his wife's head. He then fired another projectile into his mother's forehead. Both died pretty much instantly. When Patricia and Frederick arrived home, he fired a projectile into the back of both of their heads, killing them as well, before heading over to the kitchen to make himself some lunch. After his stomach was full, he drove away from the home to pick up his third child, John Jr., from a soccer game. He picked him up, took him home, and you guessed it, he fired a projectile into the back of John Jr.'s head, killing him. He then dragged the bodies of his wife, daughter, and 2 sons into the mansion's ballroom and stuffed them into sleeping bags. He left his mother's body in the attic apartment, and then he cleaned up the crime scene, removed his face from all of the family photos, and skipped town, and got married to someone new. But in 1989, he was arrested for his crimes, and in 1990, he finally confessed. Now, prior to John's arrest, the mansion had actually burned down due to suspected arson, but a new, almost identical mansion was rebuilt in its place on the abandoned and haunted grounds of the place that once played host to the gruesome killing of the entire List family, minus John, of course.